Hello and welcome to The Mastering Show. My name is Ian Shepherd. I'm a mastering engineer and I run the production advice website aimed at helping you get the best results recording, mixing and mastering your music. Joining me this episode is someone who I think it's probably impossible for you to have not heard his work. He is film score mixer Alan Meyerson. He's worked on The Lion King, Speed, Gladiator, Pirates of the Caribbean, Dark Knight, Inception, Thor Ragnarok, and Dune, which is an incredible roll call. But even before that, he had a history as a successful sound engineer in kind of more conventional, in straightforward music and ad recording, all kinds of things. So he has a huge breadth of experience. Alan, welcome to the show. Thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having me, Ian. It's kind of nice to be here. You left out a couple of things that probably they've heard even more than that, which would be like the Netflix logo. If you're a World Cup person, the World Cup theme, Thursday Night Football, all that stuff.
I didn't realize that. Yeah, that's so you're everywhere. Let's face it. That's fantastic. I want to talk to Alan particularly about his approach to mixing and I'm going to say mastering for film. I don't know whether there's really a mastering stage as such for film, and that's one of the things we want to talk about because people often ask me about soundtracks, and I've done a couple of indie movie soundtracks in the past, but that was basically a case of figuring out what the calibration level for the monitoring was and, you know, kind of making sure the surround sound was working. I'm fascinated to find out more about how you work and your approach to all of that stuff. But yeah, maybe you could start by just giving us a kind of a brief intro to how you came to be where you're doing the work that you're doing these days.
Sure. Well, I started in recording studios in 1977 out of college. I was a performance major in college and realized I didn't really have what it took to be a player. And I was a classical music major. I was a classical trumpet major. When I got out of college, I got a job in a studio like everyone else tries to do. And I worked my way up and I did okay. To skip the early stuff, at a certain point in the mid 80s, I started working with some dance record producers like Arthur Baker and Mark Kamens and Shep Pettibone and guys like that. And I was really enjoying that. And then I got into the R&B world through Polygram and did tons of R&B records. And through that, I started getting some very interesting projects, European stuff like Brian Ferry and New Order and Orchestral Maneuvers in the Dark and things that were a little quirkier. And my dream at the time was to be a kind of engineer producer in the style of Phil Ramone or a guy named Alex Satkin, who unfortunately passed away many years ago. Just as I was getting to that point where I felt like I had the skills to do it, the industry was changing. It was sort of the early 90s, and it got to a point where that role of an engineer producer was much harder to make a living at because everyone that was a producer had a studio in their house and could play keyboards and stuff like that. And I didn't have that skill set. So, and I wasn't a songwriter. I didn't know how to write. It dawned on me that being in that part of the world, that industry was, I wasn't going to be an A-list guy, and not that I need to be an A-list guy, but I wasn't enjoying it either because hip hop had come in and I wasn't really connecting with the music that was being made in the 90s. I didn't really, grunge wasn't my thing. And so, it sort of limited what I would work on where I felt like I could add value. And also, I was a huge orchestral music lover, and I liked film scores. I didn't really, film scores didn't get on my radar as an art form at that point. But I certainly loved orchestral music, and I loved orchestral writing, and I've always been a big instrumental music guy. So the thing that really turned me on in the late 80s and early 90s was bands like Return to Forever and Weather Report and things that were more kind of fusion, jazz, rock, and instrumental. So that was really where my heart was an instrumental. I was a big Chuck Mangione fan. I was a big Herb Alpert fan and Freddie Hubbard and Miles and all that stuff. So when I reached that point in early 94 where I just didn't know where I was meant to be. And I honestly, for a while, discovered that I might not want to be in the industry anymore. So I was thinking about alternatives. I spent a lot of time walking on the beach and spending my last retirement fund that I stole from myself and just basically getting by. And through a very weird kind of quirky coincidence that was sort of set up by me having a neighbor whose son wanted to be an engineer and I was getting him internships, I got introduced to the team that worked at the time, what was called Media Ventures, which was Hans's base of operations, and was invited down to just say hi. This was before I had ever met Hans, and was hanging out, and they asked me to come and engineer a session, so I did that, and it went well. And then they asked me what my skills are with orchestral music, and I told them that I was well versed in orchestral music. I didn't mention that I wasn't well versed in recording orchestral music, but in my early years I did jingles, so I did have some experience recording small orchestral music. But I believe that I would be able to figure it out, and I ended up getting put on a session with Hans and on a movie called Renaissance Man, and it went really well. And so he offered me that film, and basically said to me, "What are you doing for the next 3 months?" And I said, "I guess I'm working for you." And that was in 1994, and I'm still doing it. I'm still working with Hans. I'm still working at Remote Control. I have a room at Remote Control. But I've expanded my client list has been expanded to James Newton Howard and John Powell and Harry Gregson Williams and this guy named Chris Bowers and Pinar Toprak and, for a while, Danny Elfman and so on and so forth. And I came into the industry at a time when the industry was changing, and I had a certain skill set because of my record years and my orchestral chops that sort of gave me a unique place to go. And Hans at the time was reinventing the medium. So I was there for the reinvention, and it led to a lot of success. And since then, I've done about 300 movies and, countless video games and countless things, like I said, like the Netflix logo and Sony Pictures, and it was actually Sony Television and Paramount and stuff like that. And if it doesn't have a lead vocal, I'll mix it and I'll record it. And then the fun of it is I do get to record orchestras now, and it's become my passion. It becomes what I love to do. I've been to Abbey Road about 30 times. I've been to Air Studios probably 20 times, and I spend as much time as I can recording as I can. But I do a lot of mixing. So sometimes I mix stuff I haven't recorded. Sometimes, if I'm fortunate enough, I'll record it and mix it, and every now and then I get to produce it.
It's fantastic. Thank you. And I'm sure everybody listening to this realizes, but just in case you don't, the Hans Alan is talking about is, of course, Hans Zimmer. And I think the breadth of your experience is one of the things that I think makes you so interesting to me, because it seems, from what I can tell, that you've brought a lot of some of the kind of the music production sensibilities and methods into score mixing, right? So I've seen videos where you're, adding saturation and distortion. I saw one where you pitch shifted the brass down an octave. Is not the kind of thing that I guess traditionally we think of as orchestral mixing, which I'm guessing is really cool and part of the sound that you achieve.
It is part of it now. It's just the interesting thing. And I feel like maybe I had a part of making that happen. But I remember the first time I had to do a session at Media Ventures, and it was with actually the guitar player from Culture Club, Roy Hay. And we were doing something with sort of a kind of important rough mix and a vocal overdub and everything. And he's, thinking I'm just a scoring guy. And he's like, I want to create this effect of, the synthesizers having this pulse, and, there's a trick that I'm like, I got you, bub. And he's like, what do you mean you got me? And I said, I took the click track and I put it into the key of a Keypex and did it. And he's like, how do you know how to do that? I said, because I spent the last 15 years in the record business. What else do you need me to do? So yes, I was able to bring those skills into this, and, a more aggressive kind of approach towards percussion. So in turns with that, a more aggressive kind of approach with the whole, palette. So at that time, and I'm thinking 1994, synths had been part of score for a long time, but it really sort of, the game kind of started getting upped by the music that was being done then. I remember like Peacemaker was a really hybrid score, and I love hybrid music of all varieties. I love, like I said, jazz, rock, and fusion and all that stuff. That was sort of what lit my fire when I was young. So it was a perfect fit.
That's, something that I love as well is, when people incorporate real instruments into electronica or electronica into something that's more conventional. And I want to come back to all of that stuff. But just before we do, I'm curious about the recording side of things, because that's also something I think is really interesting about you, is that, yeah, you're mixing all this stuff, but also you're really hands-on at the recording stage, it seems like. I mean, so, because I kind of imagine people going to Abbey Road to record a film score and you could just kind of let the engineers get on with it. But I think you have quite strong ideas about mic placement and all that kind of stuff. Is that true?
I do it. I mean, I'm not, it's not that I'm the engineer that they let get on with it. You know, I show up and that's my job. I'm a freelance engineer, and, you know, a lot of people have come to Abbey Road now, and, you know, I've been there enough times that I know the room very well. As a matter of fact, when I'm not there and it's a project for me, usually there's one or two guys that we get there who sort of know my style and my basic mic complement, and they do it there. But, you know, even recording in town, I recorded at I recorded every stage and have for years. I've built up a tremendous mic collection, probably 130 mics now, and all my own amplifiers, and, you know, multiple set of monitors. I have separate recording monitors from mixing monitors, and so that's really, you know, if you're looking for the focus of my passion, that would be probably in recording large scale stuff. Focus of my business is probably mixing.
Yeah, it's interesting. But I'm guessing that actually that is a huge part of maybe the success for you. I mean, if you get it right when you record it, then to some extent it's going to mix itself. I don't mean that literally, but it's always works better when you've got it right at the source. Yeah,
Absolutely. You know, and as I got more comfortable with my recording chops, you know, which, you know, happened 30 years ago, I started, you know, being able to experiment in that world in a similar way that I was experimenting in the mix world, you know. So I would try different microphone techniques, and I would I would sort of center down onto the styles of the things that I liked, and, you know, miking techniques I love, and choices of microphones and stuff. So, you know, it's just all a big kind of like creative snowball, and wherever you throw me, I'm going to try to figure out my way to do it. And I think a lot of that had to do with the fact that when I was in the record business, I kind of got lost in the greatness of some of the other engineers, and I found myself losing track of doing things that I thought was interesting and worrying more about, is the sound as good as Clear Mountain? Does the sound as good as Chris Lord Algae and stuff? And, you know, that it's such an easy way to lose your identity when you start identifying yourself compared to other people. And I found in film music, although I respected tremendously my colleagues and my, you know, the other guys who do what I do, Sean Murphy and Dennis Sands and a million other guys, I didn't try to emulate them. I realized that, you know, I was in a lucky situation of doing something different. And if people didn't like what I did, that was okay. You know, feel free to not like what I did, but enough people liked what I did, so I was able to keep working and still keep working.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, clearly. So maybe you can just kind of give us an outline of the kind of process when you're working on film in terms of, so I'm guessing you've got your multi-miking, the orchestra, all of that gets recorded multi-track, and then you bring that in. And I mean, does synths come first? Does synths get added afterwards? Does it depend?
Sure. When you say synths, you know, there's a combination of samples and stuff. Synths to me are synths. You know, it's a Juno, it's a Zebra,
Yeah,
and
right.
stuff like that. But there's a lot of organic samples, some of which I've actually recorded, and orchestral samples. Sometimes they get used and sometimes they don't. Usually all that comes out of the composer's writing room and comes to me. And then with that, we add all of the new live elements, be it an orchestra, be it brass or a choir or drum overdubs or guitar solos or any one of 1,000 air whoos and, you know, guzhangs and stuff like that. Just a limitless, you know, menu of stuff that could end up in front of a microphone with me, and which is a ton of fun, and always, and fortunate in this way, the best players in the world. You know, I'm lucky enough to work with the NBA every single day. Every single person I work with was the best player in their college by far, you know, and that's a lot of fun. So when I bring it into the mix world, what I do is I combine all those elements, and what I'm going to ultimately deliver is I'm going to deliver a full mix, which is either going to be in, you know, 5.1, 7.1, or Atmos, or even sometimes quad, depending on what the needs are of the client. But what I'm more importantly going to do is I'm going to deliver stems where depending on the movie and the style and the reasons, they could be anywhere from 5 to 30 stems of the elements of my mix separated out that when you play it together at 0 level with no EQ and no compression equal my full mix, which is where stem mastering comes in, because there is no after me for anyone to do that other than the dubbing mixer to get into the weeds with that. And so what I try to do is give him something that is as finished as it can be when he sits down with it. And that's my sort of mastering environment is if you were to see my session, you would see my full mix, my stereo down mix, and then next to it would be a grouping of either 7.1, 5.1, or Atmos sometimes, not often Atmos, individual, strings, brass, woodwinds, if we did the woodwinds or solos, low percussion, mid percussion, high percussion, synths, rhythmic synths, linear synths. So depending on the project and the reason I'm stemming, because there's many reasons to stem, it's not for them to remix it at the stage. It's for them to have the ability to deal with certain issues down the road. And like if they change the picture and need to do an edit, they need to be able to, if they were forced to edit the entire mix, then that wouldn't be in the music's best interest, as opposed to being able to maybe keep the strings going and take out this and that so it clears a new sound effect that exists or stuff, because that's the X factor that I don't have the answer. So I'm the last guy to touch the music on a micro level. And then when it gets to the stage, it's more of a macro level where they're basically writing the entire score. And in addition to that, if there is a woodwind solo that gets in the way of a piece of dialogue, they can pull that down or out.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting, because I was curious about why you would need to deliver stems, given that you determine the mix, right? I didn't imagine that anybody would kind of come in and say, oh, you know what, he's made the brass too loud at this point or whatever. But you're basically saying it's kind of to give them control in terms of
but there is some of
precision.
That too. You got to remember, film it's a weird world. It's there are a tremendous amount of decision makers in film. So there are a lot of people that have what we call temp love, which for you guys is like, or in the music world, imagine like when you do a rough mix and everyone just wants it to sound like the rough mix, just professional, right? And I deal with that all the time. So I spend a lot of time making sure that when they go from what they're used to having in their Pro Tools rig or their Avid and to my mix, that the thing that's going to blow them away is the width, depth, the size, but the balances are going to be pretty close to what they have. So there are times when you'll come in and a director will say, I'm not quite getting the same thing out of that. What's different? And then they'll listen. Oh, the percussion was maybe a little bit louder there. So they can then have the control to push that up instead of it coming back to me. So there is a creative purpose to it, but it's not just a wholesale. I'm sending them. It's not like they're getting a multi-track and they're going to mix it from scratch. They're putting all the faders at 0, what is called the yardstick mix, and they're playing it like that. And then they adjust as is necessary. Also the fact that I'm, mixing in a beautiful mix room, but it is still just a mix room. It's not a theater. And when you add that much distance with speakers and stuff, sometimes there are things that you have to compromise or complement with low end and, certain things of clarity and stuff like that. So if you don't give them that kind of control, the downside is it'll come back to you. Now, having said that, there are movies that I've done that where we just said, no, we're going to mix it. And then I might give them percussion separate from the orchestra, and that's it. It depends on the project, and it depends on the competence of the mixers I'm delivering it to, what we call dubbing mixers. If it's a guy I work with a lot and trust and I've known, I'll give him all the control in the world. But if it's a dude that I know is the guy who puts reverb on fast drum parts or puts the guitar in the surrounds, he's not going to have the flexibility to do that, so I'm sort of, most of the time can make that decision. But the good news is we've reached a point now where all of the cream has risen to the top. So almost all the dubbing mixers I work with are phenomenally talented.
You mentioned putting guitars in the surrounds, and I was curious about that. How much you typically use the surround aspects, whether it be 7.1 or the height in Atmos. I'm imagining not that much in an orchestral context, but maybe a lot more with samples and synths and stuff where you've got effects. Is that right?
Well, yes and no. It's the Atmos thing is a different conversation because I actually don't mix that often in Atmos when I deliver to a stage because it's easy for them to implement Atmos with my mix than it is for them to have to deal with my Atmos when it comes in and has to deal with sound effects and also all the objects I would be taking up. So usually I deliver 7.1, but I do occasionally deliver Atmos. But the answer to your question is depending on the kind of movie, imagine if you had a movie where sounds were coming from the back and it made you turn around to see what's going on back there. Your filmmakers would not be happy about that. So the job of music and everything in a film is to support the film. And the dialogue, as I like to say, the dialogue is my lead vocal. So it's definitely forward focused, but that doesn't mean it can't have, it's not just reverb in the back. Like I'll take my synth pass and I'll duplicate it and do something very interesting to it and put it in the back. Or in a world where there's maybe two parts that are playing the same, that add up to one sound, I might put one of them in the back and one of them in the front. I tend to avoid moving solo instruments off the front. And when I think the front to me is not just the screen, but it's the 20% that goes to either the left or the right of the screen, which is my 7.1 speakers. When I think of the front, I want to keep my energy there, unless there's a creative decision made by the composer or the director. It's like, can we have the choir come from behind, and then if that's the request, then that's easy to do, and so I'll do all that. And that happens 1,000 times. That happens every project. But for the most part, I'm not looking to, do a pop mix where, I use the example, the Eagles, the Hell Freezes Over, when they did their surround mix and they had a voice in each speaker. Mm-hmm. That's not what I'm really looking to do. It's not my style. It doesn't mean it's wrong. It's just not my style. So it's definitely a forward-focused sound field, but with a lot of richness and a lot of depth.
Great, yeah. So if you're delivering 7.1 mix, and they're good, and obviously the film's probably going to be mixed in Atmos, they would basically just route those out to either a bed or an object bed to put everything in the same places that you have it, unless they decide to do something creative for some reason at a later stage.
Yeah, but also it could be something where they don't just have two beds. They might have as many as four. What I call boxes. So if you have that, then you could like put the brass are separate. You could put the brass up one box, and you create a lot of depth without really changing the perspectives, So that's a very cool way to use Atmos in film. That doesn't necessarily need me to deliver them a separate Atmos environment, which, I can do that and I do that depending on projects. And, there have been films where I've worked on where I did this movie, Gemini Man with Ang Lee, this Will Smith movie, and they wanted me to mix native Atmos. So they actually flew me to New York and put me on a dub stage and let me do what would be considered a final Atmos mix with elements moving around with, just as we heard it. He wanted to create that sort of immersive thing in that, and he felt that was the best way to do it. And the reason he did that was because he was here at Remote Control working on the scoring of it with Lauren Balfe, and he came into my room and I played him the new Lion King, the one we did like 5 years ago. And I mixed that in native Atmos, and he listened to my mixes, some of my mixes in that, and said, that's what I want. So, but I want you to do it in New York because I want to be able to come over at night and listen to it. So I'm like, okay, free trip to New York, staying in a nice hotel. Sure.
Absolutely. From what you've described, you're effectively the mastering engineer in inverted commas, because you have more or less the final say on what the mix is going to be, where the placement is going to be, and the dub, they're balancing that with effects and dialogue and all the rest of it. Does that mean that the loudness in terms of a specification is not that important to you? Because people often ask me, oh, if I'm delivering for broadcast, for example, how do I deal with loudness? And there's a number that you can give people there. And I know that in theaters, you have the Dolby guidelines in terms of dial norm and all that kind of stuff. But virtually everything you do is going to be adjusted at the dub, right? Because they will be deciding how loud we want the music at this stage. So I guess that's not that critical for you. Is that true? Or?
No, it's not critical. I don't think about the loudness spec at all. The only spec I think about is I actually, it's strangely enough, if you think about it, I try to print a level which will give them the music sitting at about halfway up the fader so that they have plenty of room to make it louder or make it quieter. Right. It used to be like, people wanted to print stuff as hot as you can get it. And then the music would be sitting so far down that you lost all of your sort of range in the low end for, to be able to ride it. If you're down in your logarithmic scale down at like 5%, then you have nowhere to go, So I think about that. And, but I do master it. I do a mastering process on my stems that I then print through to print tracks.
Oh, that's interesting. Can you say a bit more about that?
Sure. That's why I'm here. At the very least, there's going to be a limiter that is set to -1 dB. And I use very, very often this whole grain quartet. Do you know about that?
No, I don't.
Oh, it's great. And the reason I use it, well, one is to support a small company, and I've been using it for a long time, and I've become sort of one of their beta testers. It's a very elegant, very difficult to use thing that I just have my preset that I use. And basically what it is my preset number one is 0 additional gain and -1 dB on my ceiling, and with the slightest amount of dynamic EQ in the 250 range and the 2000 and the 2K range, just to really do the final little tap of the muddiness and the aggressiveness. And it does it very, very, and the reason I like to use that one is because it is absolutely transparent in doing that. And no matter how fast the compression, like I can set an attack time to almost 0 and I won't get any distortion or any sort of, kind of overmodulation or anything like that. So I love it for that, but that I also use other ones too. But so at the very minimum, there's that. And that sort of gives me my basic control. Now, depending on the score, if the score is an aggressive score, like I just did this Zack Snyder movie, Rebel Moon, which is coming out now, and with Junkie XL, and I know that he likes things aggressive, and I'll get aggressive in my while I'm working with the individual sounds, but that mastering level gives me that final spot to be able to make a decision that is sort of a global decision. And I really think of it globally. It's not that I never do, but it's very rare when I'll go into one of my stems and do anything different than is any of the other ones. So in a case like that, I might add an inflator. In that case, I did add an inflator, and I might even add some sort of analog emulation or, another mastering, something that has a coloration that is interesting to me, like Mauer Applebaum has this thing called the Oven, which I like a lot. And sometimes I'll use the isotope stuff. But the thing about the isotope stuff for me is I get lazy and I'm like, oh, I'm just going to find a preset and then do everything. And then I feel like, well, did I really give it my best shot? And so usually when I feel like that, I go in and there's a few things that I do, but basically I'm mastering. I'm coming up with what I think that the score should sound like. And I'm not looking for anyone to do any additional widening or do any additional, other than writing it to go along with dialogue and sound effects. There's no loudness choices that are necessary to make and all that. It's my last sort of stand as to this is what the score is going to sound like. And then what I do is once I get that sound, I take that and I print it to a full mix, both in 7.1 stereo and sometimes even in quad. And when I deliver that to the composer to get notes, they are hearing the final mix. There's no additional limiting. Well, there's a brick wall, but I don't hit it. There's no additional processing. There's no additional anything. It's just a simple, what you're hearing right now is what the stems will sound like when you get to the stage. And that is the number one thing I have to do is I can't, a lot of people, they like to put that last phase of mastering in on the full mix. And, in the record world, we always think about that compression threshold, controlling it and gluing it all together and stuff. And that's just something I've learned to not have to worry about in my world. I actually, even when I make records, which I still do occasionally, I still find it better to do that. I'm not a big, I don't do that master bus glue as much as other people do. And that's the way I do it. And it's very successful. Having said that, when I do my soundtrack album, which is me making the final decision at the loudness and stuff, actually, it is still going to go to a mastering engineer. I don't feel like I'm an adult enough yet to be able to, put the necessary coatings on it and stuff like that. So I'm still going to deliver it to a mastering engineer, but they're not really going to need to do much in terms of leveling or sound, because I'll do what I call my pre-mastering, which is, one of various chains. Some of them I have are analog chains, very simple. I have a ear 825 EQ that I like to put across it. I have a Varimu that's slightly modified, and then an Alan Smart CS1. And a lot of times that's just my chain that I use. And then I bring it back into Pro Tools and then just add a brick wall on that. Or I have like 5 or 6 different sort of combinations of plugins that I'll use just for the stereo mix, or if we're releasing a surround version or an Atmos version for that.
Yeah, that's something I'm interested in. I mean, so the difference between a mix that you're doing for theaters and one that is going to be listened to primarily at home, but also whether if you're going to do a soundtrack album, is that a different stereo mix than you would have done, or is it basically the same thing and you've just kind of tweaked?
There is no stereo mix for the theater. The stereo mix is just, it's deliverable. It's what they call a deliverable. It's just something you have to do that does represent the score. Given the opportunity and the time, if I'm allowed to take my stems and relook at them as a stereo world without having to have it be perfect for surround, I will take that time, because it's worth it every time. It's not just the processing, it's also making some creative decisions where you might have a sound is there because it's marking something on the screen that might not make any sense in just a pure musical environment. Mm-hmm. So you can adjust that stuff. Cymbals that are way too loud and drums that are played matching what's on the screen and stuff like that. You can have that last pass to do that. And at the same time, I can have my last shot at what I want. Early on, I didn't do that. I was very, very careful about not doing too much on the mastering side so that I would leave room for them. I would always send things 4 dB below where I thought it should be, with a slightly less amount of top end, because I always feel that no matter what you do, someone's going to put top end on it. So I figured instead of putting, as I like to say, a hat on a hat, or vanilla syrup on vanilla ice cream, I just sort of give them room to do that. And I sometimes do that still, but I've been sort of over the years told by my mastering engineers that, what I do tends to work. So I'll do it. And, then I'll add a tiny bit of, widening, and sort of from the upper mids up, I'll add a little bit of imaging, open it up, because the center channel information can get a little bit, depending on the balance of my down mix. Even with a perfect balance, it still benefits sometimes from a little bit of widening, and I might do a little bit of dynamic EQ or dynamic compression, and I don't know, anything's possible. Just whatever my latest, newest plugin is going to end up on there somewhere.
And how often do you get the opportunity? You said, if I have the chance to go back to the stems and revisit them.
Almost every project.
Okay. Yeah.
Sometimes I have to pay for it though. It's like I just did this huge video game, Jedi Survivor. It's very successful. We did 8.5 hours of music recorded live at Abbey Road. I recorded it. A lot of it was done live with everyone in the room. Some of it, because of COVID, we separated the brass, but it was a lot of music, 215 cues, what we call cues, which are basically little songs, and some of them big songs. And I mixed it all, and then they put together a soundtrack album and sent me the edit and asked me what I thought. I said, that's great, but you're going to let me redo it? And like, no, we don't have the budget for that. I said, hold on. These were never meant to go on the soundtrack album. Do me a favor. Just trust me. I was a producer, so I could say this. Proof of concept. Let me send you 4 of the most important cues. with my pre-mastering on it. And then you guys tell me what you think. And so be careful what you wish for. I did that. I sent it to them. They loved it. And we decided to do it that way. So now, of course, I had to remix 80 cues to get that. Now, it's not like a full mix. I do 10 a day or something, or even more. But it just gave me that last chance to do something magic with it. A lot of that is just fairy dust voodoo. And I don't know exactly, like, I was listening to one of your shows where you were getting very specific and technical, and it's like, I understand all that stuff, but my brain doesn't think that way. So it just gives me a last chance to make it as great and as full of depth and width and height and warmth and sparkle that I can.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I guess that's what we do as well. But I do think mastering is more technically oriented, probably.
Yes, and you guys are so good at it, and I always benefit from it. And many times, that adds the last quarter inch to my yardstick. But I find that there are certain things that I do. They're not just a standard way, the standard thing that happens in mastering that I'm going to want to do. And some of that has to do with image control and stuff like that, and some kind of multiband dynamics and some of it is just, what I'm used to. And there are many times where I'll go like, wow, I've really done a lot here. Why I better deliver them something that doesn't have all this, and then they can decide which one is better. And I'm not against that at all. I mean, this isn't an ego thing. It's just I want the best thing ever. But the important thing for me is sort of that last chance to do a balance,
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned there the center channel, and that's something that I'm curious about. And people often, well, I'm hearing people debating a lot about that with especially Atmos production of music. We have this new thing now with Apple Music,
Well aware of it.
Amazon.
The first Dune was one of the first Atmos scores that Apple Music took as sort of a test ride to see
really?
how it was going to sound. So that was my score.
Yeah, very cool. So you're using the center channel. I've heard some people say, the center channel is exclusively for dialogue, but I'm guessing there are no rules.
No, not true. In a music-only mix, it's used sparingly as sort of like where the center of my orchestra is. And I don't really use it much for anything that comes in, that isn't already embedded with it or that's live. Like sometimes a solo instrument, I'll put the dry signal in the center and then the reverb's around. But I tend to, even if I do that, I'll divert it from just the center to maybe all three speakers a little bit. In music, Apple Atmos mixing for music, I am discovering that the popular thing to do is to put like the lead vocal, the bass drum, the snare drum dead in the center, only to the center speaker. That's something I respect because the people that I've seen do it, I respect. But I have to wrap my head around it because to me, I can't get away from that narrowness I feel when I sit in front of a near-field Atmos environment and I hear that, so it's a work in progress for me, that one.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I haven't done any Atmos work myself yet, but there are definitely some people who are saying that, and then there's other people who say the exact opposite. And then there's people who say you put it in a bed in the center, and yeah. Anyway, we could go off down that rabbit hole. But you mentioned again there the difference between a near field and a theater Atmos mix. Can you maybe talk a little bit more about that?
Well, yeah, when you're near field, like you're working, say, on a video game or something like that, or even a record, if you're doing an Atmos mix, that it's only ever going to be listened to in near field. So there's different sort of rules that apply when it comes to management of low end and, will they have a proper subwoofer? Will they have a proper center channel and stuff like that? When I am working in a near field environment, I do use a little less center channel and a little less subwoofer because I don't necessarily know what it's going to, it's honestly, it's still the Wild West because there is no standard for like home. I mean, there is a standard, but that's assuming people are going to buy what is the standard. And, usually consumers don't do it that way. So the big difference is low end. It's just the low end tends to ruminate in a large theater. The subwoofers tend to be less musical. So they're more effects that we actually even call it that, an LFE, a low frequency effect channel. And that's used, you can imagine what it's used for, bombs and cars and, big bottom stuff. Like I'll put big low end booms and stuff in it, the low end of a linear sort of a synth pad or something if it's a deep synth pad. But in Nearfield, you don't have that. So you have to be much more articulate about it when you do a theatrical release and more careful with how much you use Nearfield. It's just a different way to think about it. In my system, my Nearfield system, my subwoofers do have a musical sound to them. So I can actually get away with putting a little bit more down there, although I'm not really in the habit of doing that. But sometimes if it's an orchestra-only score, I might put a little bit of the orchestra in the subwoofer.
That's interesting. You mentioned synths again there, and that was something I wanted to ask you about. I imagine it's quite challenging balancing synths with orchestral elements. I mean, just based on my own experience, it's like if you have, let's say an acoustic, I don't know, jazz band or just acoustic instruments and you're recording them, as soon as you start adding compression to one thing, suddenly, because that thing is much more consistent, everything else starts to need to be more consistent, and either you end up automating the death out of it or compressing everything. And I think by their very nature, most synth sounds are much more consistent than an orchestra, a string section, or a brass section or whatever. Is that something you found, or does that just kind of come naturally because of your experience?
Absolutely. I'll even take it one step further, that the orchestra can be one thing when it's not going to have to live, coexist, and then it's something else when it does. And really, once you go hybrid, if I was to take my perfectly recorded Abbey Road Orchestra or someone's perfectly recorded Abbey Road Orchestra without any EQ or without any compression. I don't do a lot of percussion, but I do some dynamic compression on orchestra, and put it up against a hybrid score. It would sound dull as anything. It's a completely different type of top end. So I immediately, when I'm dealing a hybrid score, I'm either going to darken my pre-recorded stuff to match the orchestra, or I'm going to brighten the orchestra to match the pre-recorded stuff. And that's usually the way you go. And it doesn't take a lot. I mean, I can do it with a Pultec sometimes. Sometimes I use a lot more processing. I'll use harmonic processing on the orchestra. There's a lot of saturators I'll use on it. This black box thing I really like a lot. The inflator I really like a lot. And as the cues, like on big action cues, I might get even more aggressive, and so basically you have to keep it in the sort of intent that the cue is necessary. Basically, there's three worlds of composers. There's composers that want you to blend the live orchestra with their samples, where the samples are the most important thing and the live orchestra is support. There are the reverse of that, where they want you to blend them, but the samples sit back and the live orchestra is the sound, and the samples just give you a little bit more of this sort of artificial yet very familiar sounding width. And then there's the guys that want to keep it organic. So, Hans and I used to we'd always laugh because, I would balance it, then he'd come in and turn up the samples or turn down the orchestra. And then I'd come back in and turn down the samples half as much and turn up. It's like a negotiation, and it's like that. So, all these things matter. And depending on the score, if it's a very organic sounding score with a couple of, synth pads, then yes, it's going to have maybe less top end. It's going to be, there'll be more automation involved. And, but if it's a wall of sound with an orchestra, then the orchestra is just one of the elements.
Is that typically a decision you make on a per project basis, or do you just do it per cue?
Yeah, that's a great question. I do it by listening to their ref, their mock-up, and see how it's sitting. If they're sitting very aggressive, then I sort of know. But the philosophy of what the ratio is something that travels the entire project and then might change. There's this interesting thing that people are used to the sound of string marcatos, which are basically a short string note, but the marcato samples tend to be longer than what happens when you play live. And if you don't put those short string samples in, it really does change the intent. So that's a place where you'll have to play with the level. There are times where they use samples to create a low end that's just not realistic in the world, but you need it. So you have to make all those choices and stuff. But once I sort of know what my philosophy is in terms of how much I'm going to use the samples, versus live. And usually for me, it's somewhere between 80-20, 20% being samples. I get forced up to 60-40. And once I'm at 50-50, I'm in, I have certain composers that 50-50 is, they're actually wanting it louder even.
Right.
If you were to hear it with the samples, you wouldn't go, oh, there are samples in there. It would just sound big and large and great, which is different than it used to be. Back in the Pirates days, we weren't afraid to let you hear the samples. But now I try to be a little bit more elegant with it.
Well, it's interesting because I'd never realized until I saw your video that there were synth lines in the Pirates of the Caribbean theme, just for example.
But that's the beauty of it,
Yeah.
All the low end is doubled. All the bass lines are doubled with like a bass, and it just adds a size that isn't possible in the real world. But who wants it to be? Do I care that they can't perform it at Carnegie Hall? Yeah, they can. All they have to do is have a little bit of a pre-record going, and we've done that.
That's cool. You've mentioned a few times, using Pultecs and kind of saturators and things. I've seen a video where you were using FabFilter. Is it FabFilter Saturn? Yeah. Are there projects where you just wouldn't touch that stuff, or is that just a standard part of your palette that you bring in whenever you need to achieve a certain effect? Is that a go-to technique that you use?
Yeah, it's a standard part of my palette, but I might use them so subtly that I'm really just using them more for EQ or even for dynamics. You can use a saturator that'll squeeze the frequency range together a little bit because the timbre of the signal is affecting the saturation or the decay or something like that. So there's a lot of plugins that, like for example, I use the Devil Lock, the Eventide Devil Lock, and which is a very aggressive plugin. But if you use it from between 1/2 and 1.5 in the mix, all it does is add this beautiful kind of sustain. So if I want to get something that'll peek through a little bit but still sound organic, that's a trick I use. And people look at it, they go, what are you doing? And I'm like, this is what I do. And I said, close your eyes and listen to it. And they're like, yeah, I put spring reverbs on basses. I'm a weird guy, so there was a great expression that Ed Cherney used to say, no one dances to a Pultec. It's just, however I get there is how I get there.
Yeah, absolutely. That's probably a great place to wrap up, to be honest. I don't want to take too much of your time, but if you do have time just to talk about one other thing, you mentioned something that intrigued me when you're talking about Atmos. You said that there are different boxes. And I think I've heard you talk about this, that you kind of have, there's almost height levels in the Atmos mix that you think about.
Yes. There's a dubbing mixer named Ron Bartlett, who has been one of my dearest friends for 30 years and also one of the finest dubbing mixers in the world. We did Dude together. He won the Academy Award for Best Sound Mixing. They don't give it to the music guys. I tell you how that feels. Or I'd have 7 of them. But he was the guy that sort of turned me on to the idea of the boxes. So I don't want to ever talk about that without giving him credit. And it's exactly that. It's like you have something that sits in the bed, that's the bed. And then the next one is maybe halfway or a third of the way up and 10% back. And the next one is another third of the way up and 30% back. And then the next one is the objects, and so you can basically create different levels for the Atmos stuff. And the way you set up the session, you can make quick choices. I have to work fast. If I don't work fast, I get lost in the details. I like to do, and I've said this before, I like to do 90% of the work in 10% of the time, and then spend the other 90% of the time on the last 10%.
Mm-hmm.
I find that I'm better when I'm not overthinking, basically in everything in life, but certainly when it comes to music mixing.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I agree. It's that thing of being in the zone, isn't it? That happened to me on a live stream a little while back. I was demonstrating something and I had accidentally put my screen to sleep. And what I didn't realize that when I did that, the screen share stopped. So I was busy talking to people and demonstrating what I was doing and just kind of really getting into the music. And when I eventually went back to the chat, they were like, we can't see what you're doing, which is a great exercise for them, right? Because we should mix with our ears, not with our eyes anyway. But that's
why they call us engineers,
Yes, absolutely.
But I mean, like I'm sitting here right now talking to you and I'm staring at my Pro Tools screen on the piece of music I'm working on and I'm mixing in my head. It's like I'm making level decisions and, did I have reverb on that? Let me make sure. This is what we do. I mean, this is the great thing about doing your hobby for a living is it doesn't feel it doesn't feel like you're working.
But then the bad thing is when you dream about it, round and round in circles. Did you get that?
Last night I had one that was just a doozy. Hey, I want to tell you how much I appreciate you and I appreciate this podcast channel. And, for me, it was, I discovered you because I was trying to make sure something I had discussed at Mix with the Masters, I was giving them, I had this belief of what I thought, true peak was. And so I explained it. And then I thought to myself, am I explaining it right? And then I listened to your podcast and I realized I was, maybe not as intelligently as you did, but what the information I gave them was correct. And then I listened, I backed up and I listened to more of your stuff. And I just want to say, you're really doing a great service out there. And your stuff is very interesting and listenable.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate that. And likewise, thank you. I appreciate you. And thank you for coming on and talking about all this stuff. It's really fascinating. Are there any particular places that you would recommend where if people want to find out more about what you're doing or get in touch with you, they can go?
Well, Mix with the Masters is certainly one of them. You can go on there and I have a lot of videos on there and stuff like that. And Pure Mix, I have some videos on Pure Mix. There's another one that's going up, I think, at the end of this week about mixing the Jedi Survivor score. There's a lot of content in Google, and usually at NAMM, at the NAMM shows, I'll do a presentation or two and stuff like that. But basically, if you want to get into the weeds with it, Mix with the Masters is where to go. Pretty soon, I'm going to get Alan Meyerson Music working as a website, but I haven't gotten around to it yet. I've been too busy.
That's fantastic, and thank you. And I do want to recommend anybody listening to this should check that stuff out because Alan, the videos that I've seen of Alan's, he really does go into all of the technical details and the creative details that we're all so interested in there. You're guaranteed to get some interesting stuff out of those videos. I'm going to be digging into more of them after this. So, Alan, thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It was really fun.
Likewise. And thanks as always to John for editing and mastering the episode, to Kaylee Law for letting us use his music, and thanks to you for listening.